What's up, everybody? This is Zoya, the Russian Korean. It's been a little bit of a while since I posted a video. I really wanted to post this a lot sooner than I'm doing it, but I really am not feeling good these days, so it's kind of difficult for me to get in front of the camera and try to act put together. But right now I'm feeling a little bit better, so I thought I would sneak in a video here just before I don't feel good again, which will probably inevitably happen again. My hope really is to try to get these last kind of videos about Arcane out of the way while you know the trail is still hot with the series, the first season just finishing last week, and while people still are interested in it, so that you know it's not too late by the time I post these. And then most likely I'll just have to take a little bit of a break, not too long, but I will have to take a break and then just get back to making videos whenever I feel better. But today we're not talking about me, we are talking about episodes 5 and 6. So this is from Act 2 actually, so they are not the last episodes of Arcane season 1, but they are preceding the last act, which is Act 3. In the previous video, I talked only about episode 4, and I thought that it was a little bit too much, a little bit too detailed, so I thought that this time I will put episodes 5 and 6 together, and then in the next episode I want to talk about the final 3 episodes all together. In case you haven't seen my previous videos on Arcane, you can definitely check out the playlist. And with that being said, let's get into episodes 5 and 6. So of course, because I'm talking about, you know, both episodes in one video, I don't want to make it too long, so I won't mention every single detail that I noticed or like things that were interesting, but I will try to note the most kind of noteworthy things that stuck out to me and talk about some scenes that I thought were important overall. And if there were any important details, then I will try to mention them as well. And of course, if there's anything that I don't talk about here or if I missed, then you guys, of course, are more than welcome to let me know in the comment section below. So episode 5 is called Everybody Wants to Be My Enemy. And the first scene that I want to mention is the scene between Viktor and Jayce. They are both in a lab, but we notice something interesting. There's a little bit of a change in, I guess, the mood of the lab, in that while Viktor is still hard at work on the Hexcore, Jayce is not. And Viktor, he kind of gets annoyed at that. He even says, like, this is a poor use of our time, because while he's still focused on the original idea that they had with trying to bring Hextech to the people and improve people's lives with Hextech, Jayce is now getting sucked into politics. With him becoming the counselor, he has other things on his mind. For now, the thing that preoccupies him the most is he wants to root out corruption. Now that actually is going to change slowly, but for now he has very pure, more or less, intentions, because now that he has this responsibility on his hands, he's trying to make good use of it. Now, once again, going back to the whole shifting differences between Viktor and Jayce, a little bit later, like a scene or two later, Viktor and Jayce are now in the main lab, and Viktor is looking at the Hexcore and kind of realizing that the Arcane functions differently than what they originally thought. He basically figures out that it adapts. But Jayce, he's listening to Viktor kind of like explain his discovery, and he isn't following. And as soon as the idea kind of clicks, the first question he asks is not like, what are we gonna do about it? Or what's our next step? He says, is it safe? Or he says, are you sure it's safe? Something like that. And then Viktor says, of course not. While Viktor is kind of really, really focused on trying to just explore this Hexcore and what it can do and what they can potentially use it for, Jayce is now shifting. Yes, he has political interests, but then also I think he's starting to become a little less daring, a little less about discovery and more about safety. I'm not necessarily saying that he has bad intentions at this point, but we're starting to see a different motivation for him. Okay, moving on to another scene. We see Jinx in her lair again, and she is experimenting with the little Hextech crystal. And it seems like she doesn't really know exactly what it is or what it does. It seems to me that she kind of forgot or erased from her memory the usage of the crystal that inevitably led to the deaths of her friends and her surrogate father. So she probably just kind of cut that out of her memory. So it looks like when she's experimenting with it now, she doesn't know what it does. But as soon as she puts it in and then it explodes, right? And the explosion and the impact of it kind of wakes her up. She has a flashback to that explosion when she was a kid, and she completely freezes. And when she finally comes to, she keeps muttering, "It was a mistake. It was a mistake." And we kind of understand yet again that moment was like the turning point in her life, probably the greatest trauma of her life. And we learn that she hasn't reconciled with it. She maybe just buried it deep within, but she hasn't really had any kind of closure. Now, I want to skip a little bit ahead because I want to talk about the scene at the theater and the whole thing with Medarda altogether. So I'll skip a little bit further to just a small scene that we see with Vi and Caitlyn going around Zaun, and then they visit a brothel where Vi talks to this, how do I say this, Yordle brothel owner lady. So anyway, she gets information from her, but what I wanted to note in this scene is that, Caitlyn, she kind of has to blend in, and so Vi kind of tells her, hey, you have to pretend like you're a worker here, and then you can get information from them that you want. And at first, Caitlyn is really awkward, but we see from the scene that she actually adapts really well, despite being awkward at first. So we're just learning little bits and pieces of Caitlyn's character, and also the growing relationship with her and Vi, because Vi kind of sees her becoming more adaptive, and okay, all right, she's surprised, but at the same time, like, okay, good for you. Another interesting detail that I noticed here is that when they pass by one of the rooms, you see this couple inside, and one of them looks a lot, to me, even though he's masked, but he looks a lot like the boy that comes up in later episodes when Medarda's mom shows up, and he's like her little butler boy or whatever. Anyway, not sure if that's an important detail, but just something that I noticed. But let's talk about the scene at the theater with Medarda and Jayce and what inevitably follows later. So there's this concert, right? This guy's performing on, I guess, something that looks like a violin, and all the counselors are there, and Jayce and Medarda are together on this one balcony. Medarda explains to Jayce how his recent efforts at rooting out corruption have actually created a lot of enemies for him. She's explaining to him how his little crackdown is basically putting him at greater risk, and that many of the counselors do not like what he's doing. Now, Jayce gets frustrated because he has pure motives in terms of like he's trying to root out corruption, but at the same time, he says, and I quote, "I never wanted anything to do with politics. You pushed this on me," which is actually true, all right? He never asked to be the counselor. Medarda made him one, and then now he's like trying to act the role, but he is apparently messing up, and so he's frustrated. But Medarda, she seems to see something in Jayce, and so she kind of inaugurates him into the ways of politics, and Jayce takes it. In a way, I want to say that she manipulates him into kind of playing along, and that's what the whole theater surrounding is about, right? As she is manipulating him into playing along, playing his part, being part of this show, right? Going around to different counselors, sucking up to, this guy and that guy, and then making deals and promises, playing to their interests. We see kind of this symbolic or figurative representation of it with the performer on the stage, right? And I found an interesting detail here is that everybody is involved in this kind of dance of politics, and the only one out of it is Heimerdinger. He's actually there to enjoy the art. He's the only one enjoying the art. Everybody else is there for political reasons, including now Jayce. So the fact that it's happening at a theater, it lets us know as viewers that whatever is happening with Jayce and making deals with all of these counselors, it's not because he necessarily cares, but it's a performance, right? It's a show. He needs to do this in order to further his own gains. So as he gets inaugurated into these politics, and then we have the scene with Jinx, right? Then we come back to Medarda and Jayce, apparently at Medarda's place now. I guess after the performance was over. A little bit of an after party or something, but only between the two of them. So this is what many of the fans call the scene, and that's why they call episode 5 the episode, because finally we get to see an actual league champion do it on the big screens. So what happens? Medarda and Jayce are together at her place. They have just made a lot of successful political moves at the theater, and so now they're kind of like growing a little bit closer together. And then Medarda just throws herself at Jayce and he takes it and they go all the way. They go all the way in her bedroom and we see, I'd say half of it, we see it. But the interesting thing about this scene is that it's not just that scene. It's intertwined with something that's happening with Viktor. And that's what I noticed confuses a lot of people. I've seen discussions on Twitch chat, I've seen discussions on Reddit and different YouTube comments from the videos that I've seen where people were kind of confused about like, why did they have to make it so awkward with the sex scene between Medarda and Jayce and then this other scene where Viktor is like playing with this Hextech stuff. And I thought about it, I watched the scene, and I think it actually makes sense. So there are many parallels between the two scenes. First of all, Medarda and Jayce coming together, right? And they basically hook up, right? But at the same time, at the lab, Viktor is working on something, and then his assistant, Miss Young, she comes up, and I guess it's the end of the day or something, and she's about to go home, and she's very shy, but she comes up and she basically tries to ask Viktor to come with her. I guess their home is in the same direction or something, but she asks him if you're done, maybe we could go and walk together home or something. It's so obvious that she likes him and she's trying to spend time with him and get his attention, but he's just so focused on this Hextech stuff that he's doing that he completely refuses her. And she says something like, there's always tomorrow, right? And I kind of understand where she's coming from, but the only reply that she gets from Viktor is, good night, Miss Young, right? He's done talking to her at that point, because we also understand, as viewers who have witnessed the internal conflict for Viktor, for him, there might not be a tomorrow. And so it's not about her necessarily being insensitive. It's just about him realizing that even if he does want to be close to someone, even if he would like to experience, let's say, romance or love or something like that, or even friendship with this girl, he just decides not to take that risk at all, because how is he guaranteed a tomorrow? It's basically setting yourself up for failure in this relationship, so he chooses just not to even start. Which is really sad, because on the contrary, while Viktor, because of his circumstances, has to refuse love, Jayce, on the other hand, completely embraces it. While there might not be a tomorrow for Viktor, there is all the brightest future for Jayce. And I think this contrast is really well played out in this scene. And that's why they're intertwined together. What happens next is Miss Young leaves and Viktor is trying to work on the Hex tech thing, but it's not working out. He gets very frustrated and then he passes out. Now, while Viktor is passing out, Jayce is going top. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is there are a lot of parallels that occur here. First, there are parallels of feeling. You can call them parallels or you can call them contrasts, I guess. So on the one hand, you have this agony and frustration. On the other hand, you have this bliss and this love. On the one hand, you have something very close to death. And on the other hand, you have life, or the act of living life, making life. Moreover, there are actually jump cuts between the lovemaking scene and then also the Hexcore kind of exploring Viktor's blood. And those jump cuts, they're trying to tell us that there's a parallel between the kind of unity that is created on the one hand between Jayce and Medarda, but also on the other hand between the Hexcore and basically the essence of Viktor, or his blood. I think the reason why these two scenes are also intertwined together is because there's this ecstasy that they're trying to convey in the Hexcore as well. So it's not just the two humans experiencing ecstasy together, but they're trying to show that the Hexcore perhaps also has this sort of feeling of discovery, of ecstasy, of mingling with something else. So anyway, that's why I personally think that these two scenes go together and why we see these jump cuts, and I think it makes sense. The final kind of conclusion of this, and you can sense it, is that the paths of Jayce and Viktor, their paths are not the same anymore. They're starting to diverge. They have started to diverge already before when Jayce started getting sucked into politics, but now it's even more on like the metaphysical level. They're just like growing apart. So I think that's all I had to say about the scene. So now let's move on to the other scene, the last scene that I wanted to mention from episode 5. So this is the scene where Silco and Jinx go out together at night to, I guess, the river. In this scene, we learn that Silco probably has told his kind of personal story with drowning and betrayal with Vander. He probably told it to Jinx many times because she acts like she's heard it many times. But this is actually an important detail because as far as I know, as far as I can tell, he doesn't just go around telling the story to everybody, right? Even though he has a lot of people under him and a lot of people whom he trusts with certain tasks, right? And certain missions from him, he doesn't just like share his personal stuff with people, but he shares with Jinx, and it looks like he shared it a lot, which tells me that he sees something in Jinx that he doesn't see in other people, and perhaps he can relate to her on a level that he can't relate really to anybody else. And so what happens in this scene is he kind of tries to explain to her how he reconciled with the pain of the past and became a new self, the new Silco, the one that she sees in front of him today. And so he kind of dips himself in the water and then comes out. And that, of course, is the symbology of baptism right there, plain and square. Because what is the symbology, right, behind baptism? It's not just like dunking yourself in the water. It's the fact that when you get dunked in the water, when you get immersed, it's an act symbolizing death, dying to your old self, right? And then when you come back up, then you are born again, right? You're born anew. You kind of symbolize that by coming back out of the water. And so that is basically what's happening here. Silco kind of baptizes Jinx, but not in a religious sense, but he wants her to get rid of her past fears and her past hurt, to get over that trauma from the past and to basically live a new life in a new identity. And this is where I kind of changed my mind on how I perceived their relationship. So if you watched my video for episode 4, you'd probably know that I mentioned how a lot of the scenes between them seemed kind of creepy to me and uncomfortable because I felt like, you know, he's a lot older and she's kind of younger, but she has these like daddy issues or something. And then like they're like uncomfortably too close to one another. And so I was like, what is going on? I remember watching that at first, but then when I got to episode 5 and this scene, right, this is where I kind of started to understand what's happening. And here I kind of realized that what is actually happening in their relationship is that they are a lot closer than I thought they were. He confides in her and he wants to teach her the way that he survived in the world, but not in the way that he maybe tells other people, but in a very personal way. He tells her, and I quote, "You need to let powder die so that the fear of pain will no longer control you." So this explanation shows how he actually cares about her getting over her traumatic past. So it's not like just get over it, right? It's not like deal with it or just forget it. He doesn't say that, right? He actually tries to find a solution that worked for him, right? And then he tries to offer it to her as well. He wants her to get over the traumatic past and create a new self. This is also when he says, Jinx is perfect. So forget about powder, forget about the mistakes that you made in the past. Right now, the way you are, you're perfect. And so with his help and his kind of guidance, I guess, we see a little bit later that she's able to handle the hex crystal and work with it and see the sparks and not have this PTSD kind of reaction, which is supposed to signal to us that she was able to get over a lot of that trauma from the past, a lot of that pain. And most likely this guidance kind of from Silco really did help her. So yeah, that was episode 5. Again, if there were any other scenes or details that you felt like were important in this episode, then please do let me know in the comment section below. But let's move on to episode 6. And episode 6 opens with a scene that I personally think is one of the most beautiful, actually, scenes from ARCANE. And that is a scene from Viktor's childhood. I don't know, after seeing this, I became a lot more invested in Viktor's character and his development and his story. So we see in the sewages of Zaun, we see little Viktor, probably age 10 or 11, something like that, playing with this mechanical boat, but he's playing by himself. On the other side, there are kids playing together, but they're not playing with him. But then one of the kids, it's this girl, right? She comes up on the rocks and she stares at Viktor and he stares at her. And then we hear one of the kids from the other side call out and they call her Sky. Now this is important because Sky is actually the first name of Miss Young, who is the assistant to Viktor and Jayce when they grow up. So I'm guessing that that was the first time that they met. And at the moment when they stare at each other, it's actually pretty interesting because if you look at their expressions, they both look like they actually want to talk to each other. It looks like Viktor is like waiting for her to say something, and she looks like she wants to ask him what he's doing, but then the other kids call her and then she doesn't say anything and she just leaves. And Viktor's facial expression after she leaves, you kind of see this little itty bit of like disappointment in his face, but at the same time, like, oh well, it seems like he's used to this kind of lack of interaction with others. So this is ironic, right? Knowing that later, I guess, Miss Young develops this crush on Viktor, and we don't actually know when that started. Perhaps it started all the way back then when they were still kids. Maybe she did want to play with him and talk to him and spend time with him, but she decided not to while he was willing. And perhaps because she passed on that chance to make a connection with him in the past, she is now in the present not able to make that connection with him anymore because circumstances changed and Viktor seems to have abandoned the pursuit of love in his life. But I really liked the level of detail and, the expressions and their body language was really good, especially kind of since we already know what happens in the future, and we will see it also in future episodes what's going to happen. This scene is actually pretty important. But there are other things that we find out here. Details like we understand that Viktor has had his disability from his very childhood. Another thing also is we see that he actually first meets the scientist who was behind all the shimmer stuff, which is Singed. Viktor stumbles into Singed. This is very difficult to pronounce. Into the territory of Singed. And there's this creature that lives with Singed, but looks like Singed is keeping it for something. And he says the mutation must survive. And then when Viktor offers his help, Singed kind of agrees and says, okay, we can be loners together. Which is an interesting dynamic because he could have, just a few minutes ago, he could have made friends with Sky and the other kids, but instead he meets this weird scientist and he makes friends with this guy. But they're both going to be loners. So it kind of already sets him up for the future ahead. All right, moving on. We see Jayce coming to Medarda's house and she's actually painting. He comes to her because he is worried about Viktor. He's kind of desperate. He realizes that Viktor is very ill, but also that he basically can't do anything about it. But the thing that we learn here about Medarda is that she was an exile, and it looks like she was an exile from Noxus because the painting that she was working on looks like the Noxian, I don't know what it's, I'm not sure what it's called, but it's like this fortress. You can find the pictures of it on the universe page, but this is already when we're starting to make a connection between her and Noxus. The next scene is pretty short, but important in terms of just the development of Viktor's narrative. So he's in the lab and he realizes that the Hexcore made contact with his blood and that something changed because of that contact with his blood. And something that he does in this scene is he actually reaches out and he touches it. Now, he never actually did this before. He used to always like use these kind of things to try to manipulate it and stuff, but never just like try to go grab it with his bare hands. But this time he does, and it looks like he can actually touch it now, which tells us that there is a certain connection between him and the Hexcore that didn't exist before. Looks like it was made by contact with his blood. Moving on to the next scene, we are seeing Sheriff, and he is at his home. And this scene, actually, when I first saw it, I was really creeped out. And I think you're supposed to get creeped out here. So what happens is Sheriff comes home and then his daughter is at home too, but then he opens the door and he realizes that she's not by herself. As he opens the door, he discovers that there's Silco with two of his goons, I guess, there with him. And it looks pretty disturbing, especially because like, if you imagine yourself being in Sheriff's shoes and you like come home, which is supposed to be like this safe place, he comes and he sees his daughter, right, who is very young, in the room with these three adults, all three of whom not looking very, child friendly. Just imagine that, walking into your kid's room and then like there's like three adults there. But that's the point. Silco comes to his house to basically intimidate him into following his orders. And Sheriff realizes that he has to do what Silco tells him, because something that he mentions during this little meeting is he kind of talks to the daughter, but he says, "Could you imagine being separated from your father?" Which is a direct threat to the sheriff. It implies that if you don't do what I tell you, then there's going to be consequences, not for you, but for your family. And while this scene is important in terms of just setting off this demise of the sheriff, it also is important because it shows us how Silco operates. Fatherly affection isn't his defining trait. He may have taken in Jinx and raised her, but that doesn't mean that now he is compassionate toward all other parents. He doesn't care about other people's children or their families. He has something he wants to do, and he's ready to intimidate your family for it. There are 2 more scenes from episode 6 that I want to discuss, so let's move on to those. The first one is the meeting of the counselors. So this is when Jayce proposes to dismiss Heimerdinger from the counselor's position. When Jayce starts his speech, he actually kind of parrots what Medarda said to him before. He says, "We need a leadership focused on the future, not the past." And while, yeah, Medarda told him this, and maybe he himself personally now believes it, we also know, and I mentioned this scene, and that's why it was important, from episode 4, I think, that this is actually totally not true. Heimerdinger was not focused on the past. In fact, he was focused on the future, but for him, the future was Jayce and Viktor and these new people, new minds. He trusted Jayce to be the future, but Jayce betrays him. And as he betrays him, the entire council follows suit, and we already get this premonition, kind of, that this is not going in the bright and glorious direction that they originally intended to go in. And we will certainly see this kind of regression in terms of using Hextech for not peaceful means. And the last scene that I want to discuss from this episode is the scene where Jinx lights up the lighter that Vi gave her when she was little, and then the final meeting between the 2 sisters. So Jinx goes somewhere high up and she lights up the lighter, and she actually waits for Vi to show up. What's interesting is that we see her that she has this crystal and then she has the lighter. So she has kind of a choice between the 2, which one to use first, but she decides to hold off on the crystal, on the weapon, and try to see if Vi really is here, and tries to call her with the lighter. And she waits all the way until it burns out, and then when she believes that Vi is not going to show up, she gets kind of frustrated and upset, and then she takes out the crystal and is about to use it, and then Vi does show up. And as Vi shows up, she sees, to her that's Powder, right? She doesn't look at her as Jinx, she sees her as Powder, and then she runs to her, she embraces her, and Jinx actually drops the crystal. So it kind of shows us that for a moment there was this reunion with Vi, and perhaps somewhat of a separation from the path that she was about to take. But if y'all thought this is where it was going to end, no. Caitlyn shows up and Jinx becomes extremely defensive. She kind of goes on guard again, and she doesn't like Caitlyn. And it's pretty obvious, right? Because, well, of course, she's jealous of the fact that Vi has somebody else rather than her beside her. But I don't think it's necessarily that drives her kind of defensiveness. I think it's just the fact that, to her, the fact that there is a Caitlyn, the fact that there is somebody else, right, who is kind of beside her sister, it just makes her feel like she's replaceable and useless. And that's one of the things that she's been struggling her entire life, right? She wants to be useful, she wants to be helpful, but the presence of this other girl makes her feel like she is useless. And so this chaos breaks out. There's misunderstanding after misunderstanding. Caitlyn finds out that Vi's sister, Powder, is actually Jinx. Jinx is like, oh, so this girl is an enforcer, so you lied to me, blah, blah, blah. And then the firelights show up, and then there is this fight, and then there's a lot going on in this scene. But there's one detail worth mentioning in this fight is that Vi actually witnesses Powder fighting, and she is absolutely shocked at what she is seeing because she notices that her sister, this little girl, right, who used to be so meek and weak and insecure, now is fighting to kill. It looks like she's done it many times, and Vi kind of can't believe her eyes. Because of that, she actually loses her guard, and she gets knocked out by one of the firelights. And then once again, they get separated. The firelights take Vi and Caitlyn along with the crystal, and Jinx is once again left on her own. And this is where episode 6 ends. A lot happens in these 2 episodes. There's a lot to discuss, a lot of things that I did not mention, a lot of details. So if you guys feel like you want to let me know anything that you noticed or anything that I didn't mention in this video, then please do, again, let me know in the comment section down below. I will try to make the next video on Act 3 as soon as I can. But until then, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. This was Zoya, the Russian Korean. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.